Hi guys, we're 3 minutes late and unfortunately only going to YouTube, our YouTube channel, Skeptics in the Hub. This is because the new Facebook doesn't seem to allow me to, or allow my software, my StreamYard software, to recognize it. And obviously I could spend half an hour sorting that out, but then I'd be later still, wouldn't I? So let's get the show going. It's a very interesting topic tonight. We have nuclear power, no thanks, question mark, which is a very hot topic, of course, because of climate change. Does nuclear power have a role to play? My guest tonight is John Stumbles. Hello, John.
Hello, John.
How the devil are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good, good. Yeah, I'm fine. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? Because nuclear power means many things. I mean, solar power is actually nuclear power. It's just that the nuclear furnace is not on Earth. It's out there on the sun.
Well, yes, we could get into what is nuclear, and including geothermal energy, and what is solar, including wind and hydro. But that I could fill another talk with. So,
yeah. Arguably, all of material is caused by nuclear power anyway, because the elements were formed in the stars. So that's not what we want to talk about tonight, is it? No. It's man-made nuclear power. And I think you have a presentation for us?
I do, yeah. Are you ready?
I'll give it a go.
Okay, would you like to put up the first slide?
How's this?
That's good. Okay, this talk is ostensibly about nuclear energy. Okay, stop the slide. If you're hoping for a discussion of small modular reactors, molten salt, thorium, fast breeders, high temperature gas reactors, waste burners, different sorts of fusion reactors and so on, sorry. I'd love to get my geek on and talk for an hour or two about these, maybe another day. But this evening, I want to talk about nuclear in the context of climate mitigation solutions and some of the myths about nuclear and how they came about and are perpetuated. En route, I'll be talking about climate science, skepticism, economics, development, climate mitigation solutions generally, psychology, conspiracies, activism, and more. Content warning. This talk may contain errors, omissions, inaccuracies, wild speculation, and my personal opinions. I leave it as an exercise to the listener to decide which is which. It may also contain traces of sarcasm and bad dad jokes. Firstly, this is important. Climate change, global heating, is a deadly threat. It's not the only threat we face. The next pandemic could be far more deadly than COVID-19, for instance, but it's the one I'm focusing on here. That human activities are causing global heating isn't a matter of opinion. It's the finding of the overwhelming consensus of scientific research. What is this consensus? It's not just the opinion of scientists, although it is the opinion of an overwhelming majority of relevant scientists. But if all those scientists were abducted by aliens tomorrow, the research, the papers published in high-ranking, relevant, peer-reviewed journals would still be there. And it's that body of evidence that constitutes the consensus. It's that body of evidence which the IPCC assesses. At this point, I should point out something. This talk is for an audience of skeptics. That, of course, means people who embrace the principles of scientific skepticism, thinking critically, asking for evidence for claims, being open to changing our minds when presented with sound evidence, being aware of cognitive biases and logical fallacies, and not climate so-called skeptics who don't embrace any of these principles, but try to dress up dogmatic climate denialism in more respectable sounding intellectual trappings. We know not to cherry pick evidence. I'll come on to that later. We also know about the Dunning-Kruger Effect, that when we know little about a subject, we overestimate our grasp of it. I'll probably be doing some of that this evening. I'd like to talk about a principle which I think is related, which Scott Alexander articulates in an essay he calls Epistemic Learned Helplessness. This is that on topics in which we ourselves are not experts, it's impossible to tell a valid argument from an invalid one. Take the example of climate science. We've probably all heard the simple arguments that variations in the Earth's climate are caused by sunspot cycles, volcanic activity, or Milankovitch cycles, etc. And we know that these have been debunked, and if we don't know the rebuttal ourselves, we head off to the Skeptical Science website to find it. But what if the argument is one we haven't encountered before? I came across one making claims about the cosmogenic isotope record, which sounded quite convincing. Should I accept the author's argument and believe that climate change is not caused by human CO2 emissions? If not, why not? By the principle Scott Alexander puts forward, since I am not an expert in the field, I'm not capable of telling whether it's a sound argument or not. So I should not try to judge. What should I do? I should listen to what the experts agree on. And the experts in this case are the IPCC. The IPCC is a body of experts in various relevant fields who form 3 working groups which assess the published scientific evidence. There have been 5 assessments so far, and the 6th is underway. In the 5th assessment, Working Group 1 assessed the evidence for whether climate change is happening, and if so, whether human activities are causing it. Spoiler, it is, and we are. Working Group 2 looks at how bad it is likely to be. Pretty bad. Now, Working Group 3 looks at how we tackle it, what we can do to stop or reduce it, and failing that, to adapt to the consequences. What do they find? We've probably all heard the arguments about nuclear versus renewables and whether we could go 100% wind, water, and solar, or if fusion or thorium are going to save us. And probably also whether we should all go vegan, or if grass-fed beef is better than intensively reared. But not a lot of people know this one weird trick for reducing carbon emissions, which IPCC Working Group 3 and other experts agree upon. Make people pay for emitting carbon. Economists regard climate change as a huge market failure, whether it's at the petrol pump, in our gas and electricity bills, at the supermarket checkout, or our online shopping cart. The cost of dealing with the carbon emissions inherent in the things we buy isn't included in the price we pay. As things stand, why would any commercial operator spend good money fitting expensive equipment to their factory, power station, whatever, to capture carbon emissions? With a carbon price, there's a real bottom line incentive. It becomes more profitable to produce fertilizer, steel, concrete, glass, electricity, etc., without carbon emissions than with emissions. Next slide, please. What I want to focus on most is energy. The late David Mackay, author of Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, a personal hero of mine, said the climate problem is mostly an energy problem. Stop the slide, thanks. Energy is key to all life on Earth. Everything that every living thing, including us humans, do involves energy. We are sustained by the energy our bodies get from the food we eat, which itself takes energy to grow, harvest, ship, and shop. Energy keeps us warm in the cold, cool in the heat, pumps clean water to us and takes our waste and sewage away, gets us from A to B, runs our industry, healthcare, education, commerce, computers and internet, builds houses, digs ditches and ships our goods and not so goods. But like running water, we in the rich world tend to take it for granted. We may grumble at our fuel bill or the price of the pump, but for most of us, its availability is unquestioned. Not so for everybody. We're horrified to hear of people in our own country, our own neighbours, who live in fuel poverty and have to choose between heating and eating. But for billions of the poorest people in the world, energy poverty is everyday reality. Electricity is a luxury. Having enough to charge a mobile phone and run an electric light bulb after dark is for many an aspiration. Having enough to run an electric hot plate or bottle gas stove to cook on rather than cooking over a wood fire saves the lungs of women and children and reduces deforestation. Having a reliable supply of electricity lets you run a fridge so you can keep perishable foods for more than a few hours, saving food waste and reducing food poisoning. The availability of plentiful, affordable energy is strongly correlated with prosperity, and with it, resilience to the challenges of nature and the increasing challenges caused by global heating. Now, we all know that correlation does not imply causation, and undoubtedly, some demand for energy is the result rather than the enabler of prosperity, such as when we can't be asked to turn off the lights or leave the heating on unnecessarily. But energy is essential for many aspects of prosperity. Lighting and fridges, as I mentioned, pumping clean water. We'll increasingly need desalination as climate change disrupts rainfall. Air conditioning, which we'll need more of as temperatures rise, and which not only saves lives from heat stress, but increases our productivity. Our bodies and minds work best between a narrow range of moderate temperatures. We need energy to produce fertilizer to grow crops to feed ourselves more efficiently than putting extra land under the plough to grow nitrogen-fixing plants. We need energy to produce steel, concrete, and other materials which we need to construct buildings which can withstand storms and floods. Electricity and fossil fuels free humans from physical labour growing food, gathering fuel, chopping wood, fetching water, and so on, for more productive, enriching activities. It particularly emancipates women and girls, which has been shown to be one of the most effective ways of reducing poverty and reversing population growth. And it has environmental benefits too. Replacing wood with other fuels reduces and can reverse deforestation, habitat loss, and biodiversity loss. Growing food more efficiently spares land for other activities, including rewilding. We can even produce basic flour-like foods from electricity rather than sunlight, with no land use required, allowing further reversion of arable lands to nature or other uses. So energy is vital for us to survive and thrive, and we need more of it to thrive more. But the problem is that most of the energy we've been using has had the unfortunate side effect of pumping carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, causing the global heating we're now experiencing. So we need to reduce and eliminate these emissions, and to do so by yesterday, or failing that, in the next 30 or so years, to have a reasonable chance of keeping our planet habitable for humans. Next slide, please. How are we doing with that? Not very well. Although we've known about this problem for over 30 years, our global emissions are still going up, not going down, not going down as quickly as we need, but still going up. Thanks, slide. So, how do we decarbonize our energy uses? In three ways. We can use less energy, we can capture the emissions from existing uses, or replace greenhouse gas emitting sources with ones that don't emit them. The first, reduction, includes improving efficiency and reducing demand. For example, at home we may install a more efficient heating system, or improve insulation and draft proofing to maintain the same temperatures with less energy use. And we could turn down the thermostat and put on warmer clothes to manage with lower temperatures. Next slide, please. Or we can take off our clothes in hotter temperatures. Thanks. The second is usually referred to as carbon capture and storage. I haven't got time to talk about it now, except to say it's a bunch of fairly tried and tested technologies used in various industries, but really needs carbon pricing to make it economically viable. And third is low carbon sources. Some energy sources release very little CO2 in the first place. Nuclear energy is one, and the other is a diverse bunch of technologies which go under the umbrella of renewables. The distinction is more political than scientific. The laws of thermodynamics tell us that energy cannot be renewed. It inexorably degrades from high-grade forms like electricity to low-grade forms like heat. Not all renewables are low carbon. Biomass releases CO2, some of which may not be recouped by regrowth for decades, in the case of old growth trees as a source, which is widespread and officially classified as renewable in the EU. And hydroelectric dams can release significant amounts of the powerful greenhouse gas methane from rotting vegetation submerged by seasonal changes in water levels. David Mackay chose the term sustainable energy for his book, and that indicates the important criterion. energy that can sustain human life and civilization on Earth into the indefinite future. Of the so-called renewables, there are four big hitters. Hydropower is the biggest by far, contributing more clean energy globally than all other low-carbon sources. As long as there's water available, it can be turned on or off, or up and down at will. Some countries, such as Costa Rica, boast 100% renewable electricity almost year-round using hydro. Its downsides are that hydro requires the right combination of geography and hydrology, which is increasingly at risk from climate change. Damming rivers has huge ecological impacts both down and upstream. It can cause political problems between countries sharing a river system. Seasonal fluctuations in reservoir levels can cause methane emissions, and dams can be extremely dangerous if they fail, such as the Bankao Dam in China, which may have killed up to 250,000 people. Most hydro potential in the developed world has already been exploited, but there's still scope in the developing world. Another big source of renewable energy is biomass. In fact, it's one of the most widespread in the world in the form of wood, crop residue, and animal dung used for cooking by the world's poorest people. It results in heart and lung disease in those, especially women and children, exposed to its smoke, and deforestation, and reduced soil fertility where dung could otherwise be returned to the soil as fertilizer. Biomass has in recent years become widely used for domestic and commercial heating in wood stoves and biomass boilers, and for electricity generation in power stations, often former coal-fired units converted to burn wood pellets, such as the big power station at Drax in Yorkshire. This practice is regarded and rewarded by the EU as a low-carbon renewable, but has been widely criticised for burning not waste wood, but whole trees from old-growth forests in America, and for the crucial time gap of half a century or more emitting CO2 from combustion, the CO2 being re-sequestered by regrowth of the forests they came from, when we need to be reducing atmospheric CO2 right now. There are fast-growing plants such as miscanthus, which could be used as fuel instead of trees from the old-growth forests. I don't know why they're not. Again, it's probably down to economics and market failure, but it's not much to fell trees, chop them into pellets, and ship them across the Atlantic than to use the fast-growing plants. Electricity generated from biomass is, like hydro and fossil fuels, dispatchable and turned up and down as needed to suit fluctuations in demand. The use of carbon capture and storage of biomass can not only minimize present emissions, but result in negative emissions as new plants grow to replace those used as fuel. This is known as BECCS, bioenergy with CCS. Several of the scenarios assessed by IPCC Working Group 3 rely on significant amounts of negative emissions from BECCS in order to reduce atmospheric CO2 levels and global temperature rises. Although it's been calculated that areas of land of the order of the size of India would be required to achieve the necessary negative emissions. Wind and solar are probably what most people think of when we talk of renewables. Certainly seems to be what most newspaper and website editors think of when choosing pictures, even when the renewables referred to are actually hydro and biomass. Can you put up the next slide, John? I think I've got a slide for this one. Yeah, that's it. That was Costa Rica's on 100% renewable energy. Actually, hydro, they've got practically no wind and solar. You can take the slide down. Wind works best where it's windy, and solar works best where it's sunny. Who knew? Germany and Britain are not very sunny, as the generally pale-skinned natives of these regions would seem to suggest. The popularity of solar in these regions is probably more to do with economics than physics. Neither wind nor solar can be turned up and down when we need them. Instead, both turn themselves up and down when they will. There are various ways we can tackle this problem, some more speculative and even harebrained than others, but I haven't got time to talk about them now. In practice, what happens is we have dispatchable fossil fuel, biomass, and or hydro on the grid, which we use to back up our VREs, variable renewable energy. And in reality, the backup sources are providing most of the power, with our VRE chipping in maybe 30% for wind or 10% for solar in the UK. So what about nuclear? What is the best say? For this, we need to go to Chapter 7, Energy Systems, of Working Group 3's report in the executive summary. In the executive summary of the report, they say, okay, the next slide, they say, nuclear energy is a mature, low greenhouse gas emission source of base load power, yada, yada, yada. I'd redo this bit. And the next, bring the next slide up. And the rest of Chapter 7, where they assess uranium reserves, reactor technology, next generation designs, fuel cycles, waste, proliferation, greenhouse gas emissions, cost, accidents, public perception, and so on. Thanks. It makes great bedtime reading for insomniacs, but we haven't got all night, so TLDR. It has pros and cons, but it's an important part of effective mitigation plans. And to be clear, that's old-fashioned nuclear tech we can build today, not just whizzy next-generation designs we might get in 10 years' time. Not 100% renewables, not 100% nuclear. We're in a climate crisis and we need everything we've got. Renewables, nuclear, carbon capture and storage, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, land use changes, everything. And carbon pricing, especially carbon pricing. So that's it. Our most thorough scientific assessment finds that climate change is real, we're causing it, it's serious, and nuclear is part of our toolkit for tackling it. End of story. Or it should be. But somehow it seems that some people didn't get the memo about what's cherry picking. There are people, mostly on the political right, who reject the scientific consensus and the IPCC's assessment on climate change wholesale. They don't necessarily reject all solutions. The French decarbonised their electricity with nuclear because they wanted energy security, and free market capitalists in America built nuclear power plants because they were more profitable than coal. Other people, mostly the green left, accept the findings of Working Groups 1 and 2 and the finding of Working Group 3 on energy conservation and renewables. When it comes to the rest of their assessment on nuclear, and usually fossil fuels with carbon capture, they're like, la, 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 I can't hear you. This is unfortunate because climate change is not, or ought not to be, a left-right issue. It affects us all, like an asteroid headed towards Earth, which both left and right have an equal interest in tackling. If we on the left want to challenge the right to accept the science and work together on climate change solutions, maybe it would help if we ourselves were to accept the science and work together on climate change solutions. Why is there such often furiously heated opposition to nuclear energy? I think there are several reasons. Amongst the general public, there's a fairly widespread fear, phobia even, of atomic radiation, far out of proportion to its real harms. The evidence from atomic bomb survivors, Chernobyl firefighters and cleanup workers, and others exposed to significant amounts of radiation show that it takes an awful lot to kill people. Children are susceptible to radioactive iodine-131, which can cause thyroid cancer, which happened at Chernobyl, where the Soviet government, in denial of the accident, failed to protect the local population. But even these cancers are easily treated and rarely fatal. Otherwise, radiation appears to be a very weak carcinogen. Indeed, there's evidence that at low levels, it may even have a beneficial effect, keeping the body's cell repair mechanisms exercised and reducing cancer risk. But the effect either way is so small it's impossible to detect against the much higher incidence of normally occurring cancers. Likewise for mutations. Studies show no significant increase in rates of birth abnormalities in those exposed to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or Chernobyl, which is sad for the tens of thousands of women who aborted wanted pregnancies out of fear after Chernobyl. The most widespread harm from radiation is fear of it. The wider the necessary evacuation at Chernobyl and the unnecessary evacuation at Fukushima have deprived people of their homes and livelihoods, causing stress and ill health. And evacuees' fears that they've been exposed to radiation which will ultimately kill them leads to fatalistic, unhealthy behaviours. A notoriously pseudo-scientific report on Chernobyl by Greenpeace, claiming it caused hundreds of thousands of deaths, He even ascribed cirrhosis of the liver to the accident. Sadly, that was likely to have been a real result of the radiophobia which Greenpeace have been contributing to over the years. At Fukushima, a study found that if people had stayed in their homes rather than being evacuated after the accident, they would have lost, on average, 3 months of life expectancy. For comparison, living in a city like London costs around 4.5 months. Similar fears and scientific ignorance, misinformed popular views have spent nuclear fuel, aka nuclear waste. Well, this is indeed ferociously and lethally radioactive when removed from a reactor. Its activity and danger decreases exponentially with time. After several years cooling off in a pond, spent fuel rods are transferred to robust concrete and steel casks, where they sit around doing nobody any harm. Eventually, they may be recovered and burned up in breeder reactors if we need the fuel they still contain, or may be buried underground if anyone can overcome the objections of the anti-nuclear activists who simultaneously complain of the lack of long-term disposal and object to building it. The safety of reactors themselves is another public fear. 3 Mile Island accident in 1979 undoubtedly didn't help public perception, although it did shake up the nuclear industry and resulted in improvements in safety in the design of reactors, training of operators, and organisation of the regulatory authorities. But the accident and the very real fears and uncertainty at the time made world news and impressed themselves on our psyches, whilst the quiet safety improvements that followed were never newsworthy. Likewise, Chernobyl and Fukushima attracted mass media attention, fairly justifiably in the case of Chernobyl, with the focus of attention on the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, which killed nobody, amidst a natural disaster which killed at least 16,000 people, was objectively perverse. Even as a next slide please, even as a visual spectacle, there are more compelling images, which is presumably why groups such as Occupy chose to illustrate their propaganda pieces with pictures of a fire at an oil refinery in Ichinara City instead. Thanks. The lack of casualties at 3 Mile Island and Fukushima and the relatively modest toll at Chernobyl is not what most people know about those events. And the boring, rational brain fact that nuclear energy is actually scientifically as safe, if not safer than wind, solar, and hydro, is interest only to proper nerds. Amongst green environmentalists, I think much of the opposition to nuclear and other technologies is cultural. In the early years of nuclear energy, there have been optimism and promise, and maybe hype, that atomic energy would provide electricity so cheap it wouldn't even be worth metering. And this seems to actually be the objection of some environmentalists. Partly, I think some Greens have an almost puritanical attitude that having and using plentiful energy is somehow morally wrong, indulgent, in the same way Puritans object to singing, dancing, and sex, whether or not they do anyone else any harm. There's also a cultural belief, epitomised by E.F. Shoemaker's classic book, that small is beautiful and the natural is best, and that any technology bigger and more complicated than the village blacksmith can build or repair is to be distrusted. Deep Greens even reject large offshore wind farms. In this worldview, big nuclear reactors are the epitome of human hubris, our attempt to steal fire from the gods. Maybe if nuclear energy had originated with simple, tiny reactors, next slide please, which could be built by self-sufficient off-gridders living in the woods from plans in Mother Earth News, they would have been accepted by Greens as readily as wind turbines. Thanks. And there's a view expressed by environmentalists such as Amory Lovins, who's still going today. I saw him at a public meeting in Oxford last year. Back in 1977, he thought it would be little short of disastrous for us to discover a source of clean, cheap, abundant energy because of what we would do with it. The anti-nuclear weapons and recently pro-nuclear energy filmmaker Robert Stone said, "We also thought that as you provide societies with more energy, it enables them to do more environmental destruction. The idea of tying us to the natural forces of the wind and the sun was very appealing, in that it would limit and constrain human development." So how did that work out? The idealistic environmentalists who thought we should reject clean, cheap, abundant energy in favour of the constraints of wind and sun seem not to have noticed that we had an alternative, fossil fuels, and that dirty, cheap, abundant energy did not just enable us to do environmental destruction, it is a prime source of environmental destruction itself. And what about this limit and constrain development? Whilst Lovins and Co. presumably thought, maybe correctly, that energy scarcity might constrain the wasteful development we see in our consumer fetishist throwaway society, it also constrains the development which lifts the world's poorest people out of poverty and the gradual raising of living standards of most of the world's population, which has been going on quietly and without fanfare for centuries. Half a century ago, when I was the age Greta Thunberg is now, the world's population was about half its present size, and half of those people lived in absolute grinding poverty. Today, despite the population having doubled, far fewer people, in absolute as well as relative numbers, live in poverty. And we were until recently on track to eliminating absolute poverty by 2030. But in the absence of cheap, clean energy, much of this development has been achieved with cheap, dirty energy, coal. Much of the world's population is now in a race between rising living standards, which increase their resilience to climate change, and the climate change which the coal burning that makes possible their rising living standards is contributing to. Yet many environmentalists insist that we have to globally reduce consumption to tackle climate change. This seems to ignore the need for more energy for the world's poor. Next slide. The model of one very influential proponent of 100% renewables, no nuclear plans, presupposes that by 2050, the average Indian person will have access to only 1/5 as much energy as their first world counterparts. Yet this plan is enthusiastically promoted by activists who, in almost the same breath, demand climate justice now. Thanks. I think there's another factor we need to consider. Stop the slide, thanks. I think there's another factor we need to consider in why there's such intense opposition, especially from the Greens, to nuclear energy. Let's ask an awkward question. Who is really harmed by nuclear energy and benefits from opposing it? Not ordinary people, who suffer more in ill health and death from air pollution, not to mention the effects of climate change from fossil fuels, than they are at risk of suffering from nuclear accidents. But we saw in the 1970s and 80s that the fossil fuel industry was completely wiped out of France and Sweden's electricity sectors by nuclear energy. And the USA, Canada, Britain, Germany, Japan, and elsewhere were going the same way. We know that the fossil fuel industry has spent billions on promoting climate change denialism and disinformation. Is it possible that they have had a hand behind the scenes in the anti-nuclear movement? Indeed, given what we know of their climate disinformation dirty tricks, is it likely they haven't done so? There's certainly some evidence they have. Next slide, please. An ostensibly grassroots campaign against the building of a nuclear power station in the United States in the 70s reveals in small print that is actually sponsored in the public interest by the local Oil Heat Institute. One wonders why the slogan read solar not nuclear rather than oil not nuclear. I guess that's a mystery we'll never know the answer to. Next slide. Here's more recent. Back. Back on.
Back one more. Okay.
That's on, yeah. Here's a more recent campaign by an organization called Pennsylvania Citizens Against Nuclear Bailouts. The citizens who are against nuclear bailouts include the American Petroleum Institute, other oil, gas, and fracking companies, and a Koch brothers funded lobby group. Thanks, take that down. We know that Friends of the Earth was set up in 1969 with a donation of $80,000 from the owner of the Atlantic Richfield Oil Company. Friends of the Earth was anti-nuclear from the start, whilst the Sierra Club which Friends of the Earth's founders had just left, still favoured nuclear as a less environmentally damaging alternative to hydro. And what about Russia? It has a quarter of the world's natural gas reserves and finances half its federal budget from gas exports. It has the massive Nord Stream pipeline carrying gas to Germany, which is shutting down its nuclear power stations under the influence of the Greens and replacing them with coal, and sooner or later, as Angela Merkel has admitted, with gas. Russia, along with other gas exporters, also stands to gain from other countries abandoning nuclear energy. And we know that Russia has formed for interfering in other countries' affairs to further its own national interests. In some ways, acknowledging that we in the environmental movement have probably been played by fossil fuel interests would be a less humiliating position than the alternative, which is that we have been useful idiots doing their work for them, unasked and unpaid. So anyway, where were we? Oh yes, up Shit Creek. What do we do now? Different people have different ideas. To give a rather crude caricature, there are two main camps here. One, let's call it the green camp, says technology is the paddle that got us here, so we should throw it away and rely on the wind and the waves and the benign forces of nature and Mother Earth to get us out of here. The other, let's call them blue, says it's not Shit Creek, and anyway, we should just keep paddling and it'll all be okay. However, there's also another group who say we don't just need a paddle, we need something like an outboard motor, and countries should mobilize state and industry on a worldwide World War II scale to deploy existing and inventing and develop new technologies to tackle the challenges. These people, who mostly comprise former Green Camp people, envisage a future in which people live in harmony with nature by getting out of its way and letting it do its own thing as much as possible, by living in cities and using intensive agriculture or even synthetic biology to get our food, using as little land as possible, and allowing as much as possible to revert to the wild. Similarly with energy, next slide please. Similarly with energy, using dense sources like nuclear, which impinge as little as possible. Now, next one. Yeah.
Oh.
No.
Yeah, sorry. I click it once and it goes two.
Okay. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. Now, using dense sources like nuclear, which impinge as little as possible on the natural world, rather than covering swathes of countryside in solar panels and wind turbines. That, by the way, is a proposed solar farm in North Kent on former farmland, which had been hoped to be allowed to go and revert to salt marshes, which are a very valuable ecosystem. Okay, thanks for the slide. Embracing both ecology and modern technology, proponents of this way call themselves eco-modernists. So we have different opinions, but hey, we're the apes with the biggest brains on the planet. We've got the scientific method, which has got us from banging the rocks together to walking on the moon and eradicating smallpox. Let's science it. So we look at what CO2 does to transmission of infrared radiation in air, and we find that Tyndall and Greta's great-granddad were right about that. And we measure temperatures all over the planet and compare with historical records and some Sherlock Holmes grade sleuthing to work out prehistorical records. And we find that, yes, the planet is heating. We are up Shit Creek. Next slide. And we look at what, that's it. And we look at what we can do to stop it. And we find that hydro and nuclear work really well for decarbonising, and solar and wind are pretty much also RAMs. So we get to work. Or thank you. Or that's what you might think, us being rational beings and all that. But sadly, it seems having the biggest brains isn't enough, size and everything. We also have to use them effectively. And it turns out we're terrible at that. For a start, as George Marshall finds in his book, Don't Even Think About It, subtitled Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, we're really rubbish at evaluating slowly building remote threats. Look at our responses to COVID-19. I don't mean the asleep at the wheel narcissists and incompetence in certain governments, but that most of us ordinary citizens had no real grasp of what we were facing, even as other people in other parts of the world were being ravaged by it. But another way we're bad at thinking is because we are social and tribal animals. We have a strong psychological need to belong. One of the most powerful punishments a society can inflict on a member is ostracism, being shunned by a community. We are powerfully and usually unconsciously motivated to stay in with our in crowd. Psychologists find that we process information according to how it fits with our culture. Given the same information about, say, climate change, political conservatives are more likely to discount its source and reject it, whilst liberals are more likely to accept it. Those of us in the Green movement are no less human or exempt from the same human traits. Nuclear energy, genetic engineering, small scale and localism have become matters of cultural identity. If you're a true Green, you have to be anti-nuclear, anti-GMO, pro-organic, etc. If we reject or even question these dogma, our former friends are liable to turn on us and denounce us as heretics. Thus, we are likely to accept as fact misinformation which fits our groupthink, reject facts which challenge it, and rationalize our biases to justify them to ourselves and others. The more intelligent we are, the more sophisticated the arguments we make for our beliefs will be. And so, instead of humanity uniting to tackle this threat in the most effective way possible, we are split into factions which broadly either deny the problem or deny solutions. How do we resolve this impasse? I don't know, but maybe it would help if we were at least to start talking about the problem. Not just climate change and solutions, but tribalism and how identity protective cognition is an integral part of our primal need for love and belonging. Next slide, please. And to recognise that we're all of us, left and right, red, green and blue, subject to the same human psychological pressures. We're all part of the human tribe. Thanks. Maybe science can help here. We all want to think we're with the science, and scientists seem to have this one weird trick for leveraging identity protective cognition against itself, a sort of psychological aikido. Rather than signalling loyalty to one's group through proclaiming group-endorsed beliefs, real scientists do it by showing willingness to have their work and opinions questioned and challenged, and admitting when they're wrong. Greta Thunberg famously says, "Don't listen to me, listen to the scientists." But maybe we need to not just listen to them, but to emulate their attitude. And by the way, I know Thunberg says she personally doesn't like nuclear, but she does acknowledge that the IPCC finds that we need it for climate mitigation. Would that others in the environmental movement followed her example. Similarly to Greta Thunberg's position, Extinction Rebellion are officially agnostic on solutions. They say we're not the experts and want to hand off the job of determining solutions to citizens' assemblies. In fact, it was that which overcame my initial cynicism that they were yet another green left organisation which accepted a problem and rejected solutions. Next slide. It looks very much like Dominic Cummings on the right. Thanks for the slide, yeah. XR's original strategy was based on the scientific work of Erica Chenoweth and Reyes Stephan on non-violent civil disobedience. It focused on blocking capital cities to bring governments to the negotiating table and has been remarkably successful at raising public awareness of the climate crisis and putting it on the political agenda, and getting the UK government to declare a climate emergency and commit to a 2050 net zero target in response to last April's action, for which credit must also be given to Greta Thunberg's visit and the contemporaneous screening of David Attenborough's Climate Change: The Facts. Even so, what has been achieved is still woefully short of what's needed to make a real difference. Next slide, please. However, XR's professed neutrality on solutions has not been borne out in practice. Deviating from the evidence-based strategy of blocking cities to pressurise governments, there have been XR campaigns against targets including electrified public transport and actions and messaging at odds with the science, such as anti-fossil fuels per se, not just anti-unmitigated combustion, anti-nuclear, renewables only, and anti-biotech, with a sort of anti-Monsanto conspiracist messaging one expects of anti-science environmental groups. Most of XR's spokespeople have also taken public positions unsupported by or at odds with the science, with the honourable exception of, next slide please, of Zeon Knights, who did a lot of work communicating XR's calls on radio and TV last year, including being grilled by Andrew Neil on his TV show over Roger Hallam's assertion that 6 billion people would die. Thanks. Zeon has since taken up a post as UK Director of Environmental Progress, advocating for nuclear energy in the UK, and especially for the government to continue the new build programme started at Hinkley Point C, with further stations at Sizewell C and elsewhere. Take the slide down, thanks. Full disclosure, Zeon is a personal friend of mine. Roger Hallam's claim that 6 billion people would die seems to be part of a school of thought articulated by Professor Jen Bendel in a peer review rejected self-published paper called Deep Adaptation, which asserts that a complete apocalyptic collapse of society is now likely. Bendel's work, like other climate doom and near-term human extinction ideas, has been very influential with XR's founders and within the organisation, and implicit in the movement's name and imagery. Like an inverse climate denialism, it rejects the IPCC's findings, claiming they have been watered down through political pressure and conservatism, a view that is conveyed in the organisation's Heading for Extinction introductory talks. The claims made in Deep Adaptation have recently been challenged as scientifically unjustified by a group of scientists within XR, led by Tom Nicholas, a young PhD researcher in Oxford. Tom and his colleagues accept the science that we are in a climate and ecological crisis, and that without enormous mitigation measures, some form of societal collapse is plausible, but that it is not inevitable, and the belief that it is likely hampers rather than helps us effectively tackle the challenges the emergency presents.
Tom is in your audience.
Hi, Tom. XR also has a problem of inclusivity. Next slide, please. The criticism often levelled against XR is that it is predominantly white and middle class. This causes us liberal lefties much angst, but what I rarely, if ever, hear is any acknowledgement that we are politically exclusive. We are mostly liberal lefties, and we are a minority of society, and for our campaign to be effective, we really need to include non-lefties, even conservatives. From the moral foundations theory of Jonathan Haidt and colleagues, we know that conservatives value respect for authority in a way progressive liberals lefties tend not to. Next slide. So we might as well have run the red flag up the mast of our pink boat when we called ourselves a rebellion. Stop the slide. None of this is to dismiss XR. It is not perfect, but it is awesome. XR and Greta and the school strikers have put climate change on the political agenda in a way we could only dream of just over a year ago. Next slide. That's it. Yep, brilliant. You've got that.
Is that the one you want?
That's the one, yep.
Yep.
What can we do? May I offer some suggestions? Get involved. The climate movement needs critical thinking. As Richard Feynman observed, you can't fool nature, but it also needs us to do what we can. Working with Extinction Rebellion may or may not be right for you. You can make contact with your local XR group and find out. Do ask awkward but honest questions. XR activists are going to get challenged on the slide. Next slide, please. You're going to get challenged on by members of the public and others. Okay, stop the slide, please. Go along to actions, even if just as a bystander. There are regional actions planned for the August bank holiday and an action at the Houses of Parliament on 1st of September. There's a lot of misrepresentation of XR in the media. Who knew? Find out for yourself what's going on. Tell your friends, neighbours, colleagues and families. Are we really all uncooperative crusties? Or are some of us uncooperative scientists and librarians and artists and engineers and plumbers and lecturers and doctors and nurses and housewives and house husbands? Getting involved with XR actions, if you choose to do so, doesn't mean having to choose to get arrested. There are lots of roles on the street and behind the scenes to participate in. XR is also not about shaming or blaming. Changes in personal behaviour are not enough. And anyway, none of us, especially those struggling to even make a living, can live ultra-ecologically. We need changes at national and international levels that make our lives environmentally sustainable. Please also advocate for nuclear energy as one of the solutions we need. At the moment, a new power station at Sizewell C is in the planning stage. It will be a copy of the one at Hinkley Point C, and will build on the experience being gained at Hinkley to build the same again, hopefully more cheaply and quickly by the same construction crews. Experience from countries like South Korea, which have been building nuclear ever more cheaply and efficiently for decades, shows that this is how we reduce costs. China, our partner in the Hinkley station, have already built 2 EPRs, the design we're building at these sites, in Taishan, and have an interest in ensuring that ours gets built smoothly. It's certain not to be perfect, what in life ever is, but better is the enemy of good enough, and Britain has been getting a fifth of its carbon-free energy from less than perfect generators for decades. Write to your MPs telling them you're concerned about climate change and want nuclear and other evidence-based solutions. Talk to the press and media. Maybe read Mark Henderson's The Geek Manifesto on how to influence decision-making in all sorts of ways. Educate yourselves and share your knowledge. Next slide, please. You'll find some of what I've talked about this evening on the climatechangenothanks.org website, which is mainly focused on nuclear energy. Next, please. There's also a wiki at scienceforsustainability.org, which aims to be a neutral point of view repository of all sorts of more or less scientific information on sustainability issues. This needs a lot of work to make it really useful as a public-facing resource, so if anyone wants to get involved, please get in touch. There are contact addresses at both sites. There's also a Science for Sustainability group on Facebook for science and evidence-based discussions of sustainability issues. Thank you.
Wow, that's some presentation.
Thank you.
So let me just deal with some of the questions that we've got coming in. One of the things I wanted to ask, if you knew about, is for decades now, we've been making cute little nuclear power stations that have been driving our submarine, and they don't need refueling for 30 years. The only thing you've got to put back in the submarines to allow them to continue is food for the crew. So would you recommend, instead of these mammoth nuclear power stations, why not little ones dotted about the country? And in fact, one of the audience has made that a question, if I can find it.
Okay.
Yeah, here we go. This is from Terry.
Hello, Terry. What arguments against modular small fail-to-safe molten salt reactors based on thorium? That's a different question. What you were asked. Let me answer you first, John. The Rolls-Royce is interesting because yes, they've been doing submarine reactors for years. The long refueling time is because they use highly enriched fuel, which is basically bomb grade. So you can't do that in a civilian reactor. But there is a consortium led by Rolls-Royce, which is using presumably their submarine technology to build a small modular reactor for civilian use, and they are anticipating the first one to be out about just before the end of the decade. And as small modular reactors go, it will be quite powerful. One of the other ones in the field that's likely to be out soon is 75 megawatts. The Rolls-Royce consortium one is going to be about 440 megawatts, which is actually the size of full-blown, I think, the Magnox reactors, which were our British fleet a decade ago. The price is going to be about similar to the price per unit of EPRs like Sizewell and Hinkley Point C, but because the price to buy a single one of them will be, I think, just under 2 billion, that is comparable to the price of a large offshore wind farm that can be raised by developers without huge government involvement.
Yes.
So, but Terry's thing about thorium is The thing with thorium is there's a lot of development work to be done on establishing a thorium fuel cycle, and on regulation, which is red tape, and also technology. There are various different sorts of molten salt reactors. I think the thorium-based ones, the most well-known one is Kirk Sorensen's Lifter design, which is based on the design at Oak Ridge National Laboratory back in the 50s and 60s, which ran for a few months. But to scale it, to get it to go as something you can run for years on end, there are going to be materials corrosion problems and stuff like that. Also, various problems with the continual reprocessing that is required by them, with proliferation concerns as well. It's something that we can certainly be working on, but don't hold your breath waiting for it to come in.
Yeah, once you start shipping radioactive fuel around, there's a risk that it could be hijacked, isn't there?
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, I mean, the thing with current generation stuff is the International Atomic Energy Authority sort of controls on it, I think, are fairly stringent and really mitigate against it, anything getting in, crossing over from civilian to military use.
So it takes a long time to make a nuclear plant, at least the ones that we build now, which are massive. And the argument here is that we need a solution now.
It's funny enough, this came up yesterday. Somebody posted, there's a really nice time-lapse video of building a wind turbine in, I think it's development in Pakistan. And the amount of groundworks and everything that goes into it, really staggering. And at the end of it, you had a 1.5 megawatt turbine. Now, you can get much bigger ones, but I was trying to work out, supposing an EPR takes 10 years to build, that same 1.5 megawatt turbine, you would have to be building just under 2 of those a day to achieve the same rate. And then you've got to do something about the intermittency, which is something I left out of my talk. I didn't have time to talk about it.
Well, you're going to be asked about that in a minute.
And the cost thing is, I think economics is one of those things a bit like statistics. There's lies, damn lies in economics, and depending on how you slice it up. I'm not up to speed with the economics. I think depending on what your market is like, it can look like one's cheaper than the other. Certainly, the sort of raw cost at the time, for instance, that the Hinkley Point C strike price of £92.50 a megawatt hour was agreed. Onshore wind was a bit cheaper, and offshore wind was coming in a bit more expensive. Wind has dropped since then, but you're not really comparing like with like, because with wind you're not paying. I mean, like we said, we need to price the externalities of carbon emitting sources. Carbon pricing. That's what the economists, the IPCC, find. You also have externalities to intermittent sources, because you have to do something to make them able to work reliably. So you need masses of storage, or you need to build twice the amount and have massive transmission lines to somewhere where the wind is, like half a continent, or the other side of the continent, where the wind is guaranteed to be different. Things like that. So, if you work in, or you've got to have backup systems, which at the moment is what we have, which are fossil fuels. So, you can't just drop in wind as a replacement for nuclear.
No, and it's always difficult to predict the future, isn't it? There's so many factors involved in costing things. It's a guess, really.
Yes, yeah. And part of the cost, I mean, one of the things about Hinkley, just to say, is part of the extreme cost of that was the neoliberal financing model, which means that actually 2/3 of the cost of that is is interest on the money being put in to build it. Big projects like that used to be done and can still be done if governments stop, being such bloody, right-wing sort of neoliberals. So we mustn't govern. If governments can raise finance at very low rates of interest, and you could, have a plant that was a third the cost of that if you did it that way.
So interest rates, of course, are not predictable very easily, very accurately anyway. But what if we had a global grid? Because it's always raining and winding somewhere.
This is one of the things that I had to cut out from my talk. But if anybody is seriously talking about shipping I mean, the pylons, the 440 kV pylons that we see across the countryside, those carry of the order of a gigawatt. There may be 2 gigawatts, maybe, but ballpark figure. High voltage DC, maybe, I don't know, maybe you could get 10 gigawatts on a pylon with several lines on it, something like that. But
then you get losses, don't you, with DC?
Yeah, well, you get lower losses, but let's ignore that's not the main problem. The thing is, Britain has a total energy consumption in the not just electricity. Electricity we consume about 50 gigawatts. Our total energy consumption is about 200 gigawatts equivalent, and a lot of that wants to be electricity because we want to decarbonize, and a lot of decarbonising is going to be electrifying things. So, if a high voltage DC line would take, say, 10 gigawatts, you'd need 10 of those. And where are you going to connect them to? Okay, let's say we build huge solar in the North African desert and say to France, hey, do you mind if we put 10 great big pylon lines across your country to channel the electricity up to us? Germany has been stymied for years in trying to build transmission lines between the wind-rich north of the country and the energy-hungry south of it, and has just been opposed by, objectors in its own country. That's not international diplomacy. So I don't know what these people who are talking about global grids are smoking, but I'd really like some.
I was tempted to do a German accent for NIMBY, but I don't think I'll bother.
No, don't.
So here's another question.
Renewables now form a reliable baseload supply, rendering the main argument nuclear obsolete. E.g., Mark Diesendorf. Mark Diesendorf, and there's the. Jacobson is the big shot in this. There's also, university in Denmark, something like that. But I don't think any of the sort of mainstream energy experts. Okay, interestingly, Mark Z. Jacobson, the Stanford guy who proposes 100% WWS, has been producing plans for various for years now, and he was recently challenged on his modelling by a renewables expert, somebody who actually is not a nuclear proponent. It's actually a renewables expert who published a paper criticising his work. Jacobson's response was to sue him for $10 million and sue the National Academy of Sciences for publishing the paper, and to withdraw his suit before it came to court, leaving his opponent saddled with tens of thousands of dollars of legal bills to pay. There doesn't seem to be any scientific consensus. Certainly, I mean, the IPCC has looked at Jacobson's papers. I don't know if it's looked at anything Diesendorf's done, but the IPCC doesn't seem to accept that 100% renewables, 100% nuclear. Basically, we're in a climate crisis and we need everything we can get.
Well, you can't get much further away from consensus if they're suing each other, can you?
I don't know. Sorry, Will. I have no idea about the politics of that.
This is the...
Let me know if you find out, because I'm interested.
Yeah. Well, there will be an opportunity to continue to comment when this becomes a podcast after we stop live stream. So this is the Brexit, the monster of Brexit raising its head, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, I think you've been fantastic, and we've still got an audience, and we've got lots of people who have commented. I haven't put up all the comments because not all of them have been questions. Okay. But thank you very much for watching, those of you who are, and thank you very much, John, for presenting.
Right, and thank you for inviting me.
Take the rest of the day off.
Okay. Cheers. Good night.